The British officer barely glanced at him. Just another enslaved servant moving through the camp, carrying water, mending tents, invisible. Exactly what James wanted. In his mind, he was counting. 12 artillery pieces positioned along the ridge, 300 infantry behind the earthworks, cavalry horses restless in the morning fog. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, and the rope would be around his neck before sunset. But as he moved through the shadows of Cornwallis's camp in the summer of 1781, James Armistead carried something more valuable than any weapon, information that could end the war. He just had to survive long enough to deliver it, to understand how an enslaved man came to walk freely through enemy lines, risking everything for a country that didn't yet consider him a citizen. We need to go back. Back to a Virginia plantation where a young man named James lived in bondage, watching the war unfold around him like distant thunder. The year was 1780, and the American Revolution had been raging for 5 years. But in the fields of New Kent County, freedom was just a word whispered in the dark, never a reality you could touch. James was sharp, sharper than his circumstances allowed. He watched, he listened, he remembered everything. When the Continental Army passed through Virginia, he saw something that changed him. Not just soldiers, but the idea of soldiers. Men fighting for something they believed in. And among them, a young French officer whose name rolled off tongues like poetry, the Marquis de Lafayette. Only 23 years old himself, Lafayette had crossed an ocean to fight for American independence, bringing French troops and a fierce belief in liberty. When he established his headquarters in Virginia in 1781, James made a decision that would alter the course of history. He would volunteer to serve Lafayette, not as a free man, he couldn't be that yet, but as a spy. The audacity of it still echoes across centuries. James approached his enslaver, William Armistead, and secured permission to serve the Continental Army. Then he walked into Lafayette's command tent and proposed something extraordinary. He would infiltrate British lines, pose as an escaped slave seeking refuge with the crown, and gather intelligence. Lafayette, young and bold himself, recognized the genius of it immediately. The British wouldn't suspect an enslaved man of being a patriot spy. They'd see him as property seeking a new master, not a soldier fighting for a cause. But James saw something else. He saw a chance, not just to serve, but to prove something the world kept denying, that a man in chains could be every bit as brave, as clever, as essential as any general in a gold-trimmed uniform. What happened next would change everything. Summer 1781. General Cornwallis commanded the British forces in Virginia, and he was winning. The war in the South had turned brutal, and the British seemed unstoppable. Lafayette's smaller Continental force was desperately trying to track Cornwallis's movements, predict his strategy, find any weakness to exploit. That's when James walked into the British camp. Imagine the terror of that first moment. James had to sell the performance of his life. He was just another runaway, he told the British sentries, fleeing patriot masters who beat him, seeking the protection King George had promised to enslaved people who joined the British cause. The British believed him because they wanted to believe him. They needed laborers, servants, guides through the Virginia countryside. They looked at James and saw exactly what centuries of slavery had taught them to see. Not a threat, but a tool. They had no idea they'd just invited their own defeat to sit at their dinner table. James became indispensable. He moved through Cornwallis's camp like smoke, serving officers, tending horses, lingering near war councils just long enough to hear fragments of conversation, troop movements, supply shortages, morale problems, the name of the port where Cornwallis planned to dig in and wait for, British naval reinforcements. He absorbed it all like sunlight, storing every detail in a mind that had been sharpened by years of having to remember everything while appearing to notice nothing. But the truly brilliant part, the move that elevated James from spy to legend, came next. He convinced the British to let him carry messages. The British thought they were sending him to spy on Lafayette. They gave James reports to carry to other British positions, intelligence about patriot movements, orders for coordinated attacks. They trusted him completely. So James would take these messages, slip out of the British camp, and run straight to Lafayette's headquarters. There, Lafayette's officers would carefully open the British dispatches, copy them word for word, then reseal them perfectly. James would memorize every detail, then deliver the British messages as ordered, returning to Cornwallis's camp with false intelligence Lafayette had carefully crafted for him to carry back. He was a double agent before the term existed. A triple game played with the stakes of an entire nation. In the shadow of the British camp, every step could be his last. One suspicious officer, one broken seal noticed, one contradictory piece of intelligence, and James would face a death more horrible than he could imagine. The British didn't execute spies cleanly. They made examples of them. And for an enslaved man caught betraying his masters, the punishment would be designed to destroy not just his body, but any hope other enslaved people might harbor about resistance. James knew this. He walked with it every day, that knowledge like a stone in his chest. But he kept walking. Through the long, sweltering summer of 1781, James fed Lafayette everything. He reported that Cornwallis was moving toward the coast, specifically toward a small tobacco port called Yorktown. He detailed the British fortifications, the number of troops, the placement of artillery. He described the layout of the camps, the routines of the sentries, the times when the British were most vulnerable. He revealed that Cornwallis was expecting naval support from New York, that everything depended on British ships arriving before the French fleet could block the Chesapeake Bay. Lafayette took this intelligence straight to General Washington. And Washington, that careful strategist who never gambled unless he could see the path to victory, finally saw his opening. The pieces fell into place like a prayer answered. Washington marched his army south in secret. The French fleet arrived first, blocking the bay, trapping Cornwallis. On September 28, 1781, American and French forces surrounded Yorktown. Cornwallis found himself encircled, cut off from escape or reinforcement, facing a siege he hadn't anticipated because his intelligence had failed him. Or rather, because his intelligence had been poison, carefully fed to him by the man he'd trusted to carry his messages. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. James watched from Lafayette's side now, no longer needing to hide. The bombardment was relentless. Day and night, American and French artillery pounded the British positions. The same positions James had mapped, described, counted. Every cannonball found its mark because James had drawn the map. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. 7,000 British troops laid down their arms. The war wasn't officially over. It would take 2 more years of diplomacy, but everyone knew this was the end. America had won its independence, and James had helped deliver it. But no one knew what he carried in his mind, the full scope of his contribution, the risks he'd taken, the genius he'd displayed. When the victory celebrations began, James stood in the shadows again, still legally enslaved, watching free men celebrate a freedom he'd fought for, but couldn't claim. Lafayette tried. The young Marquis understood the injustice burning at the heart of the revolution, that men fought for liberty while holding others in bondage. He wrote a recommendation for James, a testament to his service, praising his intelligence and courage. But recommendations didn't break chains. In Virginia, enslaved people could be freed by their enslavers, but the process was complex, expensive, and rarely pursued. William Armistead, the man who legally owned James, didn't free him, not then. So James went back. After walking through enemy camps, after carrying the intelligence that won the decisive battle of the Revolution, after proving his courage and brilliance beyond any doubt, James Armistead went back to the plantation. Back to bondage. Back to being property. But something had changed in him. Perhaps it was serving alongside Lafayette, being treated as an equal, being trusted with stakes that high. Perhaps it was knowing what he'd accomplished, carrying that knowledge even when the world refused to acknowledge it. Whatever the reason, James didn't give up. He couldn't accept that his story ended in chains. For 5 years he petitioned the Virginia General Assembly for his freedom. 5 years of applications, testimonies, letters. Lafayette's recommendation helped, but bureaucracy moved slowly when it came to freeing enslaved people. The irony was crushing. The same government he'd helped establish now dragged its feet on granting him the liberty it claimed to hold sacred. Finally, in 1787, the Virginia Assembly passed a special act. After years of fighting, James Armistead was granted his freedom. He was around 33 years old. More than half his life had been spent in bondage, and now, finally, he stood as a free man. In honor of the French general who'd believed in him, who'd seen past the color of his skin to the courage underneath, he took a new name. He became James Armistead Lafayette. He lived another 40 years as a free man. He bought land, 60 acres, his own piece of the country he'd helped create. He married, raised a family, became a respected member of his community. In 1824, when the aging Marquis de Lafayette returned to America for a grand tour, they reunited in Richmond. The scene captured in paintings shows them together. The aristocratic French general and the formerly enslaved American hero, embracing as equals, as friends, as brothers in a war they'd won together. He waited. He won. And in the shadows of history, his courage burns brighter than any medal ever could. But here's a twist. James Armistead Lafayette wasn't the only shadow working to win American independence. There was another network, the Culper spy ring.